The Atlantic Ocean sparkled like an endless mirror beneath the sun, but beneath its waves lay one of history's largest and most hidden graveyards. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, more than 12 million African men, women, and children were forced across the Atlantic in chains. They were torn from their homes, branded as property, and packed into ships designed not for human travel, but for profit. For every body that survived the journey, another perished, suffocated, starved, or simply thrown overboard. The captains called it cargo. The merchants called it loss. But the ocean called it something else: memory. The Middle Passage was not a single voyage, but millions of footsteps leading into darkness. Shackled in holds so tight they could barely move, captives lay shoulder to shoulder in filth and fever. The smell of rot carried for miles, a stench so strong that sailors sometimes gagged before even lowering themselves into the decks. For the enslaved, the ocean was both cage and tomb, its vastness mocking every whispered prayer for escape. And when storms came, when water ran low, or when profit demanded it, hundreds of men, women, and children were hurled into the sea. Some still wore shackles as they sank. Some cried out in languages that would never again be heard on land. Their deaths were written into the balance sheets of insurers and merchants, but their voices were left to the waves. This is the story of the Saltwater Slaves, the drowned, the disappeared, the forgotten souls of the Middle Passage. The journey began on the African coast, where men armed with muskets and greed hunted villages for captives. Some were sold by rival chiefs, others seized in midnight raids, still others tricked with promises of trade. Bound with ropes, they were marched to the shoreline, the roar of waves announcing a future from which there was no return. At the forts along the coast, Elmina, Cape Coast, Ouida, the captives waited in dungeons carved from stone. Darkness pressed against their skin, damp walls dripping with salt and fear. The air reeked of waste and sickness, and the cries of children echoed against chains that rattled with every movement. When the ships arrived, the prisoners were herded out like cattle. Branding irons scorched their shoulders, marking them as property even before they stepped aboard. Shackled in pairs, they shuffled up wooden planks, the ocean wind carrying their sweat and terror into the open sky. Below deck, the world narrowed to a coffin-shaped space. The ceiling was so low that no one could stand upright. Wooden slats cut into bare skin, leaving sores that festered in the damp heat. Each person was given less room than a corpse in a grave, and still they were expected to survive the weeks ahead. The sailors spread nets along the sides of the ship, not to catch fish, but to stop captives from leaping into the sea. Still, some tried. Mothers clasped children to their chests and hurled themselves overboard rather than face what lay ahead. Their bodies vanished into the waves, but their defiance rippled on. Disease moved faster than the wind. Dysentery left the decks slick with filth. Fevers burned through the crowded holds, and smallpox marked faces with sores until eyes swelled shut. The sick were often dragged above deck only to be pitched into the ocean, their chains clattering like bells of mourning. Each morning, the crew opened the hatches and forced the captives to dance. Chains rattled as starving men and women were driven to shuffle on weak legs, beaten if they faltered. The sailors called it exercise. For the captives, it was humiliation carved into muscle and bone. Rations were little more than beans and rice, sometimes spoiled before they were served. Water was measured in spoonfuls, and when barrels ran low, desperation grew. Thirst cracked lips and split tongues, and the ocean itself seemed to mock them, endless and undrinkable, shimmering beyond the rails. At night, the Atlantic whispered with the groans of the ship. Captives lay in rows, chained ankle to ankle, unable to turn without dragging their neighbor with them. In the dark, they whispered prayers in dozens of languages: Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, words that wrapped together like threads of resistance. Some voyages turned darker still. When storms delayed the journey and food dwindled, captains ordered the weakest cast into the sea. Insurance companies reimbursed lost cargo, and so drowning men and women became an act of profit. Bodies splashed into the waves while the ledgers stayed balanced. The sea grew heavy with memory. Sharks followed the slave ships for miles, drawn by the trail of flesh and blood that spilled into the waters. Sailors spoke of fins cutting the waves behind them, an escort of predators that knew the Middle Passage as a hunting ground. Yet even in the abyss, resistance did not vanish. On some voyages, captives rose in revolt, seizing knives, breaking chains, fighting desperately to reclaim their freedom. Few succeeded, but each rebellion carved a scar into the myth of docility. Their cries of defiance rose above the crashing waves. Every drowning, every scream, every silent sinking added to an invisible nation beneath the sea. The Atlantic became not just water, but a graveyard of millions. No headstones marked their resting place, only waves rolling endlessly against unseen bones. Sailors sometimes claimed to hear singing from the depths, songs carried on the wind that no living throat could produce. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps it was memory refusing to stay silent. For the enslaved, the ocean was both captor and witness, a tomb that still speaks in whispers of foam. When the ships finally neared the Americas, the air in the holds was thick with death. Survivors sat among corpses, chained to neighbors who had stopped breathing days before. The stench was so overpowering that even hardened sailors covered their faces with cloth as they descended. At the harbors of Jamaica, Charleston, Havana, and Bahia, the captives were driven ashore, blinking against the sudden blaze of sunlight. Their legs buckled after weeks of confinement, and some collapsed on the docks. Traders prodded them upright, eager to display their human wares to waiting buyers. Those who survived the ocean crossing bore scars that never healed. Ankles bruised by iron, backs striped by the whip, eyes dulled by hunger and grief. They were inspected like livestock, teeth pried open, muscles squeezed, skin examined for disease, every gesture erasing the last trace of their former selves. But the ocean never released its grip. Those who had drowned remained present in memory, haunting the minds of survivors who whispered their names in the night. To endure meant carrying both life and death together, a double weight that bent spines and hollowed hearts. Merchants counted profits, captains signed papers, and insurance agents filed claims. On their ledgers, numbers replaced faces, columns replaced cries. Yet between the lines of ink lay invisible ghosts, the saltwater slaves whose worth was measured in currency, but whose humanity defied erasure. For the enslaved who lived, every plantation field was shadowed by the sea. The crack of the whip echoed with the splash of bodies overboard, and the rhythm of forced labor carried the pulse of waves. The Middle Passage was not left behind at the shoreline. It followed them into every furrow of soil they were forced to plow. In secret, some remembered through song. They wove African rhythms into work chants, layered hidden meanings into hymns. Beneath the words of survival lay a chorus of mourning, a reminder that the dead beneath the ocean were still part of their story. Music became a vessel, carrying memory where words could not. The Atlantic itself became a grave with no markers, stretching from Africa to the Americas. Historians estimate millions never reached the shore, lives erased, families severed, names forgotten. But in coastal communities, stories endured, of ancestors who chose the water over bondage, of spirits that rode the waves at night. On certain shores, fishermen whispered of lights that glimmered above the sea, as though souls rose briefly before sinking again. Mothers told children that the ancestors watched from the waves, listening, waiting for freedom to reach all their descendants. The ocean was a cemetery, but also a sanctuary of memory. Even centuries later, standing at the edge of the Atlantic brings a silence that words cannot fill. The salt air carries echoes of groans, chains, prayers, and songs that once filled the holds of ships. The waves strike the sand in steady rhythm, like the beating of a drum no one alive remembers how to play. Some voyages became infamous, their names burned into history. The Zong, a British slave ship in 1781, sailed with water running low. The captain ordered over 100 enslaved men, women, and children thrown into the sea, not because they were dying, but because insurance would cover the loss of cargo if they drowned. Profit outweighed life. Survivors later testified, their words echoing in British courts. The judges did not debate whether lives had value, but whether the insurance claim was legitimate. Human beings had been reduced to numbers in a ledger, and the ocean became their tombstone. The case horrified abolitionists, sparking outrage that fueled their cause. But the Zong was not unique. Dozens of captains made the same choice when storms dragged voyages into starvation. The sea absorbed their crimes, and the silence of the deep kept secrets that only fragments of testimony reveal. For every ship remembered, many more slipped into obscurity, their drowned passengers nameless. On African shores, families waited for those who would never return. Mothers searched the horizon long after the raiders had vanished. Fathers sang mourning songs to rivers, believing their children's spirits might follow the water back home. Villages were emptied, lineages broken, yet the ocean tied the living to the lost. In the Americas, descendants carried whispers of the crossing. Work songs bore rhythms of paddles on rivers, chants echoed the cries of shipholds. In dreams, some said, ancestors returned from the water, their faces shining with salt, urging the living to endure. The Middle Passage became not only history, but haunting. Sailors, too, carried scars. Some confessed that they could never forget the sounds of chains and prayers, the splash of bodies cast overboard. Others hardened, turning cruelty into routine. The ocean was impartial, but men who crossed it rarely returned unchanged. The sharks that followed slave ships became a symbol in oral tradition. Children were told that the fish still patrol the routes, guarding the souls of the lost. Elders pointed to the sea and said, "Listen closely, you can hear their voices in the waves." The Atlantic became more than water, it became memory alive. Archaeologists have since searched for wrecks of slave ships, hoping to recover traces of those who never reached land. Each anchor, each rusted shackle lifted from the seabed speaks louder than written records. The ocean floor holds a history written not in ink, but in iron and bone. On islands of the Caribbean, rituals remember those drowned in passage. Libations poured into the surf, drumming at the shoreline, prayers rising with smoke. These ceremonies are not only mourning, they are acts of defiance, declaring that the dead will not vanish into silence. For the African diaspora, the ocean became a paradox, a barrier that tore families apart, but also a bridge carrying memory across centuries. Songs, stories, and spirituals crossed back and forth, reminding descendants that even in death, their ancestors resisted erasure. The water bound them together. Historians call the Atlantic the world's largest graveyard. Millions lie beneath its surface, far more than any battlefield or cemetery can hold. No markers rise above the waves, but every tide that breaks on a shore carries fragments of their story. Standing at the edge of that ocean today is to face a silence so vast it feels alive. The sea reflects sunlight, yet beneath it are shadows that will never be lifted. Each wave is a voice, each ripple a memory. The salt itself seems to weep with what it contains. Among the rare voices preserved are those of sailors who confessed their horror in journals. One described the holds as a slaughterhouse of the living, where moans never ceased. Another wrote of watching captives leap into the waves, calling out to gods he did not know, leaving behind a silence heavier than chains. Enslaved survivors who managed to speak later told fragments of their ordeal. Olaudah Equiano, once a captive himself, remembered the suffocating stench, the cries of despair, and the terror of the sea. His words carried the memory of those who had no chance to testify, placing their suffering into print that could not be drowned. In the Caribbean, memory took root in music. Drums echoed the rhythm of chains. Call and response songs mirrored the voices of captives whispering in the dark. Each beat was a protest, each lyric a monument. For descendants, these songs carried not just grief, but defiance, ensuring that the drowned would be remembered in every note. On American plantations, the Middle Passage became a ghost that never left the fields. Work chants spoke of rivers and seas, even for those born far from the coast. The ocean lived inside their words, a reminder that their chains had once been forged not only in iron, but in water. In African villages, elders told children about those taken and never returned. Some said their spirits had joined the ancestors beneath the sea, watching with eyes made of salt. Others believed the drowned had become part of the ocean itself, rising in storms and whispering in the tides. Generations later, descendants in Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States still feel that pull. Some visit the shoreline to pour offerings of rum or flowers into the surf, speaking names they may not know but claiming kinship nonetheless. The ritual is both mourning and reunion, a bridge across centuries. Modern scholars call the Middle Passage a social death. But for the communities who remember, it is not death at all. It is survival etched into memory, a survival that includes the dead as much as the living. To speak of the saltwater slaves is to bring them back, even if only in words. Even the geography of the Atlantic carries their presence. Historians have mapped the currents that bore slave ships westward, and divers have traced the wrecks that never reached shore. The very paths of wind and wave are haunted, marked by roots carved in blood. The ocean remains restless, as though unwilling to keep its secrets forever. Storms crash against the coasts of Africa and the Americas, roaring like the voices of those who once filled its depths. Each hurricane season feels, to some, like a memory rising from below, too powerful to be ignored. In some traditions, the Atlantic is called a second womb. It swallowed millions, but from that suffering came new peoples, new cultures, new nations. The African diaspora is itself a testament that even when bodies are broken and drowned, identity can endure, carried forward by descendants who refuse to forget. Today, divers descend into the Atlantic, searching for the bones of history. Off the coasts of Cape Verde, the Bahamas, and South Africa, they find rusted shackles, splintered planks, and anchors buried in the seabed. Each artifact is a voice rising from silence, proof that the drowned are still present. Museums have begun to display these relics: the iron cuffs, the cramped diagrams of ship decks, the maps that charted human misery. Behind the glass, visitors see not just objects, but evidence of a crime written on the ocean. The exhibits are quiet, yet the weight in the air is unbearable. In coastal communities, remembrance is woven into ritual. In Ghana, libations are poured into the sea as drummers call the spirits of the lost. In the Caribbean, flowers are cast onto the waves, floating for a moment before sinking. Each gesture acknowledges the graveyard beneath the horizon. In the United States, scholars and descendants walk the shores of Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, imagining the ships that once anchored there. The waves that lap at the docks carry memories of chains rattling across planks, of captives blinking against a sun they feared they might never see again. For the diaspora, the Atlantic has become a place of pilgrimage. Some stand on African shores to say farewell, others on American beaches to say welcome, all bound together by the same water. The ocean that once divided now serves as a bridge of memory, uniting the scattered children of the crossing. The Middle Passage is no longer just history. It is a presence that shapes identity. It lives in the sorrow of spirituals, in the rhythm of drums, in the whispered prayers of mothers rocking their children to sleep. The salt in the sea is mirrored in the salt of tears carried across generations. On some nights, storytellers say, you can still hear the Atlantic singing. The crash of waves is a chorus, the hiss of foam a whisper of languages once thought lost. The ocean has never forgotten, and it refuses to let humanity forget either. For historians, the Middle Passage is a ledger of numbers. For descendants, it is a wound that bleeds through time. For the ocean, it is an archive of souls, a library without books where every tide turns a page. And so the memory endures, not as silence, but as echo. Every shipwreck recovered, every song preserved, every ritual performed is another act of resistance against forgetting. The saltwater slaves may have been drowned, but their voices rise still, carried on the waves that touch every shore. The Atlantic, stretching endlessly from horizon to horizon, remains the largest cemetery on Earth. No stone marks its graves, yet no visitor can stand at its edge without feeling the presence of those who rest beneath. The ocean breathes with their memory, eternal, unyielding, and alive. To speak of the Middle Passage is to speak of an ocean filled with names we will never know. Each wave that crashes against the shore carries fragments of their stories. Each gust of wind whispers the prayers that once rose from the holds of ships. The Atlantic is not empty, it is alive with memory. If you have listened to these voices, let them not vanish into silence again. Remember the men, women, and children who were torn from their homes, who drowned in chains, and who still rest beneath the waves. Their struggle and their suffering are part of our shared humanity. Share this story so that others may know the truth hidden in the ocean's depths. Honor the memory of the saltwater slaves by carrying their voices forward, because history only dies when we stop telling it. If you believe these stories must continue to be told, please support this channel, like this video, subscribe, and share it with others who care about uncovering the hidden chapters of slavery's dark past. Together, we can ensure that the Middle Passage, the largest graveyard on Earth, will never be forgotten.